Pastor Brian from Summit Church here. I had an email exchange with our missionaries in Ukraine a couple weeks ago that really affected me, and it forced me to confront some things. That email thread and what it revealed are the topic for this week's edition of Wednesday's Words with Pastor Brian. Summit Church supports two missionaries in Ukraine. John Musgrove attended our church while he was a student at Boise State, and then he went on staff with Campus Crusade when he graduated. John has served in Ukraine for about 25 years now. The other is Sasha Zebrov. Sasha's a man that John discipled and raised up through his ministry in Ukraine, and Sasha is now the director of crew for the entire country, overseeing 120 staff members, including John. John and Sasha were invited to speak at a missions conference in the United States, and they contacted me a while back to say they wanted to make the most of their trip here and planned to visit other cities, including Boise, while they were in the country. So in early January, John texts me to ask if he can use the lobby area here at church to give a ministry presentation on a Sunday afternoon. He's done this the last few times he was here. It allows for folks from other churches who support him to come hear about his work. So I checked the church calendar. I saw that the date was free and I penciled them in. Well, then about 3 weeks ago, we went over the February calendar at our staff meeting, and I mentioned this gathering that John had scheduled for the afternoon of February 12th. And one of the other guys says, "You know, Brian, that's Super Bowl Sunday." I was not aware of that fact when I scheduled this meeting for John and Sasha on February 12th. Now, I think we all know that a ministry meeting at 4 in the afternoon on Super Bowl Sunday is probably not going to be very successful. But here's the honest thing going through my brain as we had this conversation. John and Sasha are doing ministry in a war zone, literally in the middle of a war. You've probably seen it on the news. They're traveling all the way to the United States and want to share with us what God is doing. And I have to call them and say, well, the game's on at that time. I mean, you can imagine how I feel having to contact them with this new information. I don't want to set them up for failure by scheduling their meeting during the big game, but I have to confess, the whole exchange we had on this topic made me feel like we take a lot of things for granted and that my faith as an American can be kind of shallow at times. Now, let me be clear. I'm not against the Super Bowl. In fact, I think we can leverage it for good. I lead one of the small groups here at Summit Church, and our group is getting together that night. The game is really secondary. You know, the point is that it's a fun time for folks to get together and build stronger relationships as we eat food and hang out for several hours. I know several other groups who are planning to do the same thing. This is good within the life of the church. And you may have heard about the Christian advertising campaign called He Gets Us that's airing commercials during the Super Bowl. Another way we can leverage this for good. So I'm not criticizing the whole Super Bowl thing, but that said, I want to make sure we honor our missionaries and provide adequate time to hear how God is using them. You know, John grew up in the United States. He understands that having a meeting in the afternoon of the Super Bowl is not going to produce the results he wants. I'm not sure what Sasha thinks of all this, but we decided to give the teaching time during this Sunday's worship services to John and Sasha. Now, since we made that decision, Sasha emailed me again to say that he's had to cancel. Here's part of what he wrote. I want to read it to you. In the email he sent, he said, "I see the situation in Ukraine has become more difficult because of the war. It looks like the Ukrainian government has started a new army draft campaign. There is high likelihood that some of our staff could be drafted into the army, and this would include some of our leaders. I feel that I need to be closer to our staff while they're going through this difficult time. I'm planning my next trip into Ukraine for the first part of February for a couple of weeks." He normally works, he's in Budapest now, and he's heading up into Ukraine first part of February, may be there now and will be there for a couple of weeks. He closes by saying, "I'm sorry for this last minute decision." Sasha feels bad about not being able to come, and yet he's out doing the work on our behalf as one of our missionaries. I replied to Sasha that while we'd love to see him in person, we agree. with his decision to stay and minister to his staff during this time. I also told him that we would continue to pray for him. Now, John Musgrove is still coming, and we will take a week off from our sermon series through Sermon on the Mount this Sunday to hear from him. I'm looking forward to seeing John and hearing about what God's doing in Ukraine. I encourage you to come this Sunday. But this whole episode serves as a reminder for us how easy we have it in the United States. We forget that there's people all over the world for whom life is very difficult. Some folks, like the Ukrainians, are facing war. Others are facing famine, or they live in refugee camps. There was a story in today's paper about Christians being persecuted in India. And while there's nothing wrong with enjoying a football game or some funny commercials, we don't want the shallowness of our culture to let us hide or ignore the bigger picture. And that's what I was confronted with as I interacted with John and Sasha. That's a good reminder, one I needed. Hearing from John in person this Sunday will really help us see things clearly.